15 minutes, he talked about some of what you just mapped out in terms of what a lot of folks are looking at as a realignment in terms of the groups of people who backed him. He did say that he believes he has a mandate. Here's how he describes it. He says, quote, "It's a mandate to bring common sense back to the country." So I said, okay, well, what is the first order of business on your to-do list once you're back in the Oval Office? He said it was to make the border safe and secure. He, of course, leaned into his long-held plan, mass deportation plan. I tried to get some specific details. What does that look like? How much would it cost? On that point, Katie, he said it's not a question of price tag. It's really not. We have no choice. When you have people killed and murdered, when drug lords have destroyed countries, and now they're going to go back to those countries because they're not staying here, there is no price tag. So that was certainly notable. He also talked a bit, Katie, about the conversations that he had with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. He called them very nice, very respectful both ways. He said Vice President Harris talked about transition. She'd like to see it be as smooth as can be. And I agree with that, of course, 100%. He said very similar conversation with the president as well, that he wants to see a smooth transition. Of course, the transition 4 years ago was not smooth. On January 6th, we all saw that, the violence that unfolded in the Capitol. I asked him, Katie, about the calls that he's had with foreign leaders. He said he's had about 70 phone calls with foreign leaders so far. I asked him to start naming them. He said, well, you give me some names and I'll tell you if I've spoken to them. Prime Minister Netanyahu, yes. He talked about a number of European leaders, including President Macron. He said he has spoken with President Zelensky. I asked if he's spoken with President Putin. Of course, he's talked a lot about wanting to end that war. He says he can do it in 24 hours, even though a lot of people hear that and say, well, that would require Ukraine to give up its territory. He said he has not yet spoken with President Putin, anticipated that he will do so. Tried to get a few details about his cabinet, Katie. The conversation kind of ended on that point. But he did, when I asked him if Susie Wiles is someone he's looking at as his chief of staff, he said she would certainly be a contender. She is great. So a number of headlines coming from a pretty brief conversation, the first one since he has won and is now president-elect of the United States. Katie.
Kristen Welker, moderator of Meet the Press. Kristen, thank you very much. And joining us now, the New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, staff writer at The Atlantic, and MSNBC political contributor Mark Leibovich, and the 19th editor-at-large and MSNBC political contributor Aaron Haynes. Everyone, welcome. Peter, I'm going to begin with you. The Democratic Party now is doing a bit of soul-searching as Donald Trump prepares to retake the White House. And they're doing that soul-searching based off of who they lost this time around. Not only did fewer people come out to vote, millions fewer people, but those that did shifted to the right. And they shifted in most all places, 90% of counties, and in some really notable ways, including what I just laid out at the top of the show in New York City. I wonder, when the Democratic Party looks at this today, Peter, what is the takeaway?
Well, look, I think it's going to be, you say soul searching. In other words, for it would be bloodletting. It's going to be a pretty sharp debate, I think, going on for the next year or two to figure out how they lost. Remember, the Republicans went through this after 2012 when they lost the Mitt Romney race to Obama. They did what they called an autopsy. How did we lose, they asked. These are important questions for any party that loses. Now, what's really interesting about that as a historical analogy is that all the things that the Republicans said that they should do differently and better through that autopsy turned out to be the exact opposite of what Donald Trump ended up doing. So the problem is that, yes, you can sit there and say, well, we should have done this and we should have done that, but you may not, in fact, actually be diagnosing the problem correctly. And you may have somebody come along who proves the exact opposite. We have a situation here where the Democrats ran a very specific candidate, I guess a very specific candidate. Donald Trump was a very specific appeal. The question is whether that's a permanent change in our political alignments or whether or not it's sui generis to him. And do the Democrats need to do something different next time around based on Trump, given that he won't be the one who runs in 4 years? Or do they need to think through how they connect to voters in a more broad way?
Yeah, Aaron, this is not, we can't say Donald Trump was an anomaly any longer. Donald Trump has now been elected twice. He's been the dominating factor in American politics now for 9 years, and by the end of it, it'll be much longer. Can we say, though, now that this is the end of something else? This is perhaps the end of the Obama coalition?
Well, I don't know if that is where things are now, but I do think, to your point, Katie, what we have seen and how we get to this moment is the staying power of the former president, who is now, the president-elect. You have to also consider the fact that he has a very young, among the youngest vice presidents in U.S. history, in J.D. Vance, who was also very much on board with Trumpism. So we may not be seeing the end of the Trump era with the end of a Trump second presidency even, right? So I think that as Democrats are kind of doing this soul-searching, hand-wringing, whatever you want to call it, understanding, what people's concerns were around the economy, around immigration, two of the top issues that people, cited as motivating them to vote the way that they did at the polls. I think that that's going to be important. Really, what do they do around rural voters, around white working class voters, right? I think that's going to be something that they continue to look at. Non-college educated Americans also, these are the kinds of people who are feeling left out by politics, regardless of what the Biden and Harris administration was saying about the strength of the economy. That was something that they were saying they were not feeling. They were resonating with the former president's comments around immigration. And so, yeah, I think that we have not necessarily seen the end of we're not necessarily seeing the end of the Trump era. And at the same time, we don't yet know which direction Democrats are going to go from here.
What is the message that Democrats take when, of all the demographics that went to Trump, maybe the most surprising one is that young women went to Trump? Not older women, young women went to Trump. How did the Democrats absorb that when they were running off a message of women's health care, off of, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, saying that Donald Trump will be a threat to your very well-being, your body?
Yeah, I think that's a real question. And let's be specific, Katie. We're talking about young white women. Young black women were among the 92% of black women that supported Vice President Harris, which was unsurprising. We saw the enthusiasm and the excitement around her campaign, particularly around black women. But when we are talking about young women, who are these women? Where were they? Some of them, may be voting in some states for abortion ballot measures and voting for former President Trump. So, how do we kind of begin to square that? I think we saw in the 2 years since Dobbs, abortion being a huge issue on the ballot for millions of women across the country, but it was not as much of a priority for them this cycle as the economy, especially for white women who we saw still breaking in the majority for Donald Trump overall.
All right, Mark, I want to get you in on this. David Brooks said this is another message from the American public to Washington, to the elites. Do you hear us now that this is the Democrats being out of step, fundamentally out of step with the way that the rest of the country sees itself, what the rest of the country is concerned about, and what they want to prioritize?
It's a take you see a lot. The question is, how do you put that into the real world of politics these days? The fact is, at the very least, Democrats have the gift of clarity. There's not a lot of people second guessing whether Kamala Harris should have spent more time in Wisconsin or whether, even it was just a decisive whooping across the board. And there's a real, I think there are some big conversations that are being queued up. And I think what Brooks is talking about is something that's probably going to play out that conversation is going to play out over a number of months. But I think also, just a little historical perspective, recent historical perspective. Republicans were in deep despair after 2020. They had just lost the White House. There was seemingly a very vocal population in the party to move on from Trump after how that presidency ended. He had just single-handedly lost the Senate for the party. 2016, 8 years ago, similar despair to what we're having now. Peter talked about 2012. So, 4 years is a long, long time in politics, and cycles of despair move very quickly. And, ultimately in 2020, the Democrats did turn back to Joe Biden, an old familiar figure. Who will they look forward to? Who will Republicans look forward to after Donald Trump's administration ends? So, look, there's a lot obviously out there, but I do think there's at least clarity at this moment, and at least like a space to sort of work through the muddle.
There are some out there arguing just sit back and let Donald Trump do himself in. Let his policies speak loudest. The mass deportations, watch how that goes. The flooding the cabinet with loyalists over those with experience, see how that goes. A tariff across all goods coming into this country, see how that goes. See how Americans actually like it when Donald Trump is able to put the policies that he wants into place. Is that a good strategy? Is that, the sitting back and letting him do what he will a good strategy in the long term?
Yeah, I don't think sitting back is ever a good strategy necessarily. But I mean, the fact is, though, it's a lot harder to govern than it is to oppose. And Democrats, unfortunately for them, are in the minority, and they control 0 chambers right now. And, the Republicans are going to actually have to try to execute on some things. When you look at the one chamber that did control over the last 2 years, the House, it was a disaster. They did nothing. So what will it look like when they have all 3 chambers? I mean, Donald Trump's first 2 years in office, the first time around, was kind of uneven, didn't get a lot of the things he wanted to get done. So we'll see. But obviously, Democrats need to figure out a voice to sort of operate and resist from within all of this.
I wonder if we can say yet, Peter, what the guiding principle of the next Trump administration is going to be. Don Jr. has been out there saying recently, but also saying a few months ago, that what they want in the Trump administration are loyalists, people that will let Donald Trump do what he wants to do, people that will allow him to be president, unlike the last time around when he had all these aides who were, acting as the bulwark against his worst impulses. What is the guiding principle for a second Trump presidency going to be? Should we look to Project 2025? Donald Trump's disavowed it, but a whole lot of people who are very intimate with Donald Trump and his allies are the ones who wrote it.
Yeah, look, I think Project 2025 is a pretty decent guide to what we should expect. Even if he's disavowed it, as you say, it was written by people he trusts and has installed in the past in positions of power, and he's likely to put many of them into positions of power again. And what we saw in the first term was there are plenty of people who were working for the Trump administration who managed to do things that were on their own agenda, maybe not his agenda, just by keeping them under the radar, keeping them off of his radar screen. As long as he didn't pay attention, they were able to do a lot of things that they thought were important or that they thought were long-term goals, particularly conservative goals. And I can see that happening this time with some of these Project 2025 things. Even if he's not particularly wedded to them, if he puts people in place who are, they will have some latitude. Now, to your previous point, I think one thing we've learned in the last 8 years is that the most effective opponent to Donald Trump actually hasn't been the Democrats. It's been Donald Trump. The most times that Trump has ever gotten in trouble are because of his own, self-destructive habits and, his own, tripping up over his own words or over his own actions. The Democrats have done less to discredit him or to attack him than he has done to himself. And so that's the motive behind that thinking you're hearing. But I think to Mark's point, obviously no political party likes to sit back. And certainly one that wants to return to power has to define itself. And they're going to define themselves, of course, in opposition to Donald Trump.
All right, Peter Baker, Mark Leibovich, Aaron Haynes, thank you for starting us off today. And still ahead, what about the anti-Trump Republicans? What are they preparing for as Donald Trump takes office? Plus, who is on the short list for key roles, and what does Donald Trump want them to do? A lot of that who and the what will depend on how many seats Republicans get in the Senate. So far, the 2-seat majority that they currently hold might end up holding Donald Trump back from some of his more out there choices. We are back in 90 seconds.
I didn't have to spend my life trying to find my calling. Mine found me at an early age.